Now, there's not a JayEmm Awards, but if ever there were, and there was a category called Most Dedication from a Follower, I think a strong contender will be this guy in the passenger seat right now, because he's travelled all the way from the Netherlands, which if you're from America, that involves getting on a boat, by the way, to bring me his car for review. And we're talking about a 2000 Toyota MR2, sometimes called the MR2 Spyder, sometimes called the MR2 Roadster, sometimes called the MRS. It's the third and currently final iteration of Toyota's little sports car for the people. Now, I don't know how things are where you guys come from, but here, if you want to buy an MR2, this is the cheapest one, and it's also the newest, which tells me only one thing. People don't really like them. That, to me, has always seemed a little bit unfair. Now, I've generally had only a passing interest in any MR2, but lately I've gained a real fondness and appreciation for the second generation car. And with the weather getting a bit nicer, I've been thinking about getting myself something of a fun convertible as a daily. And with the limited budget that I have as a smaller YouTuber, one of these has been fairly high on my list. I mean, there's a lot, as far as I'm concerned, going for it. It's not a bad looking car. Okay, it is quite blatantly a bit of a rip-off of the then relatively new Boxster, but that's fine, I don't really mind that. It's kind of quirky and cute. It's very lightweight, so if you subscribe to the whole Lotus light is right school of thought, it'll please you there. This car weighs in at under 1,000 kilos. It's considerably lighter than its forebear. It's available with a little 1.8 litre four-cylinder engine, which is actually relatively economical when it wants to be, and the interior is not that bad either. In fact, I would say it's a pretty high quality one when you consider the fact that this was a cheap Japanese sports car. So what is wrong with it? Well, I mean, if you just look at it, I suppose you could say that it rides a little bit too high, but maybe the biggest issue is the choice of engines in this car. Now, I'll confess to having made a little bit of a mistake myself, or a false assumption. I had just thought that these were available from factory with the 190 horsepower 2ZZ that was available in the Celica, or the Celica as the Americans like to call it, of the time. I was wrong. You can only have this 1ZZ 140 horsepower engine with not a lot of torque, and that's a bit of an odd choice. I can't think of any decent reason why Toyota would do that. I mean, they had the spicier engine available to them. It will fit in the engine bay just fine because loads of people have done the conversion, and it's a brilliant engine that suits a small lightweight sports car down to the ground, as proven by Lotus, who put it in the Elise, and it was one of the best engines Lotus have ever had. Now, this car is a bit of a novelty to the channel because it is almost completely stock. In fact, the only modifications are an uprated head unit for the stereo, a different tip on the exhaust, and a short shifter kit. Now, the short shifter has taken me a little bit of time to get used to, but it's not so bad once you kind of know what it feels like. It is an incredibly short throw, and I am always slightly worried about putting it into the wrong gear. It's possibly got something to do with the fact that I did that in the last MR2 that I drove. Now, this car's owner has told me that he intends to buy an Elise and go on a road trip with it at some point. And so he's interested in my opinion on how this compares to that iconic Lotus car. Well, I can tell him with some authority that actually when you start pushing on, it is very different to an Elise. The front end washes wide quite easily, and that's going to be a lot down to the suspension. So my Elise had aftermarket nitrons on, but they were the softest nitrons that were available. Even still, that was a very planted car. Now, the Elise had an issue with the fact that it was so light. When you were trying to get a move on in less than ideal conditions, that very low front weight actually could work against the car. It's something that can happen with all mid-engine cars. If the front isn't hooked up, you're in trouble, and you might just assume that it would always go around a corner, but actually that's not the case. And in hard braking as well, if the road's wet in a lighter car that's mid-engined, well, the front's got nothing pushing down on it. In fact, in my Elise, if you look at the weight figures, the front end has only something like about 300 kilos on it, and that's not a lot. This is not going to be far off. It's a little bit heavier than my Elise, but not by the margin that you would think. This car does counter by being an awful lot more comfortable. I mean, way comfier. It's actually, well, really nice. I'm struggling to think of a better word to describe it than that. However, you can tell that it's possibly a little too soft on the suspension if you want to drive aggressively. I mean, this also has its original wheels on here, which are relatively small, and you've got big side profiles on the tyres, so that's all going to add to this sort of feeling of relative softness. Now, the steering isn't as heavy as it is in the Elise. This is electrically assisted, and it's not lacking in feel. The car turns nicely. You can feel that the chassis does exactly what you tell it to. There's no hesitation whatsoever. That's one of the benefits of having a mid-engine car, is your polar moment of inertia is very low. What's that mean? Well, that is the time it takes for a car to go from being told to turn to turning. Mid-engine cars naturally are very good at that because they haven't got any big mass at their extremities. Refinement is actually also quite impressive in this car too. I took it out with the hardtop on earlier to see what it was like, and actually it was very coupe-like. In fact, these cars look great with the hardtop on. It's actually one of the most successful styling exercises of a convertible with hardtop on that I've seen. Now, the MR2 lasted quite a while, being in production, I think, for about 8 years in total. There was a facelift in the middle of that, which brought with it a 6-speed gearbox. This being an earlier car, has the 5-speed. Now, the 6-speed, the initial 5 ratios are geared precisely the same as this, and 6 was a longer cruising gear, which means that if I was going to seek one of these out, I would want a 6-speed gearbox. If you're considering one of these as a first convertible, it's certainly got a lot going for it. You can pick up a immaculate one of these in the UK for only a few £1,000s, and it will be a real minter. And there's a lot of them that have been well looked after, and the good news is that they were popular enough that there's still a lot out there. Granted, they are now beginning to disappear, as with all things of this age, but they generally seem to be quite solid little cars. There are a few issues with them, particularly earlier ones, and the general boogeyman of this car is the precats. They are known to disintegrate, and they can then be sucked back into the engine. If you don't believe me, look it up. In fact, the Ferrari 430 even suffered from a very similar problem, with disintegrating cats being eaten by the car. In the Ferrari, it's quite expensive to put right. In one of these, it's still going to wreck the engine, but the good news is the replacement engine is relatively cheap, or it'd be a good excuse to do a swap with one of these. Now, you may have already seen the fact that I have driven a heavily modified V6 example, and I believe I've also been offered a 2ZZ swapped car, so I'm hoping that in some point in the near future I'll be able to drive that and then see whether that really does work better in this car. Another thing which is Elise-like is the view out the front. You've got these two little humps where the light clusters are hidden, and that helps you place the car. Not that it's particularly difficult anyway, because it's a nice little size, this. It looks like it's a bit wider and chunkier than an MX-5, but I'm not sure it's significantly bigger. It's a styling thing, more or less. With the little wind deflector at the back up, which actually does make a difference, it's not too bad in here. The Elise, again, is a bit better on the interior refinement front when you're at speed with the roof down. Of course, the problem with an Elise is that when you're on the motorway and you want to just cruise, it's still shouty and rattly. This car feels much more refined. You can feel the front and back in this car wagging around quite a bit. In fact, in many ways, it actually bears resemblance to the second generation BMW Z4 that I drove down this road. You really can't push hard with it. In fact, even at these modest speeds, I'm not doing the speed limit and I can feel the front washing wide there. So even something like a hot hatch is going to run away from you on these roads. That being said, having driven a heavily modified example, I do know that with some help they can be excellent handling cars, even as much as my BMW M3 is on track. In a corner, a modified MR2 will keep up with it, no problem at all. This one, though, I've actually got to be a bit careful with because you can get yourself into trouble with it. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the softer suspension is responsible for some of the car's wayward handling reputation, because you can't control the mass quite as easily when it seems to be bouncing around. I'm not quite sure what Toyota were thinking. However, if you're not trying to treat it as a 9/10 car and you treat it as a 6/10 car, it is much more enjoyable. And with that engine not being too shouty, actually it's quite easy to kind of relax in this and to just float down the road with it. In fact, a lot about it feels like it wants to be a nice, decent, fun little convertible daily. However, there is one massive problem which single-handedly stopped dead my search for one of these. That's the boot space. There's basically none. I mean, seriously, look at it. It's comical. You get the spare in there and you're done. There's a sort of bench-type storage space behind here, which is actually more generous than you would think, but if I want to get my bare essentials into this car, which is my filming kit, I couldn't do it. It would be impossible, and that's a great shame. So I can kind of understand why Toyota didn't really sell very many of these, because if you want to go away, not really going to be the easiest thing, and that's why I have mega respect for Peter, because he is doing just that. He is going away, and not only is he going away in this car, he's going camping as well, the mad Dutch bastard. So I wish him the best of luck, because I took the Evora camping once and I thought I was being brave, but to do it in one of these, that's a special level of crazy. But it's an interesting car, this. I think in truth, the second generation MR2 is the better car. It's better handling, it's got more storage, and it's got more exciting engines. This is a great base to modify a car, and I know that, and for a track car it's awesome fun, and for just I'm going to go out for a drive type car, you modify this up, they are quite cool, but as standard, doesn't quite handle right, hasn't quite got the storage, and they didn't put a sexy engine in it. Very odd for Toyota to get it quite so wrong, really. But there we go. That is the third generation Toyota MR2. Thanks for watching. Thanks very much, Peter, for coming over all the way. And we'll see you guys for the next one. Bye-bye.